For decades, the US and Iran have been locked in this shadow war, right? All sanctions, proxies, covert actions. But how did it all suddenly erupt? I mean, 70 years of tension just boiling over into direct military strikes? That's what we're going to unpack.
Yeah, that's really the big question here. This relationship, it's like a pendulum, constantly swinging back and forth between, cautious diplomacy and just outright confrontation. To really get our heads around the full picture, we're looking at a pretty unique source today.
So here's the interesting part. The source we're using for this explainer, it's actually written from the perspective of February 2026. Yeah, you heard that right. This lets us do something different. We can trace not just the history, but also a potential future, which, well, it gives us a really crucial and honestly a pretty sobering look at where this all might be headed. Okay, so to really understand what's happening now and this projected future, we've got to go back, way back. The deep-seated mistrust between these two countries didn't just pop up overnight. Nope, it was forged in a series of what our source calls memory-making shocks. And here they are. These are the foundational moments. It all starts in 1953, right? A US-backed operation overthrows a democratically elected leader. That single event becomes a cornerstone of Iran's entire story about foreign meddling. Then you have the definitive break in 1979, the Islamic Revolution, and of course the US embassy seizure. These are those memory-making shocks we just talked about. I mean, they're pivotal, traumatic events that just lock in mistrust on both sides for generations. It makes any kind of reset almost impossible. 444. Just let that sink in. That's how many days American diplomats and citizens were held hostage in Tehran. That number, it's absolutely burned into the American psyche. It created this equally powerful grievance that has shaped U.S. policy for decades.
So after all those decades of hostility, that pendulum we talked about, it swings, and it swings hard, right towards diplomacy. The big issue on the table was Iran's nuclear program, and what came out of it was one of the most complex international agreements ever put together. This was the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It was all built on a very careful step-by-step process. So first, the big international powers finalize the deal. Then it's formally adopted, and then, and this is the key part, you get to implementation day. That's when the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, verified that Iran was holding up its end of the bargain, and boom, major sanctions get lifted. For a little while there, it really seemed like a totally new path was possible. And then, just like that, the pendulum swung back. And it swung back hard. May 8th, 2018. The United States just pulls out, unilaterally withdraws from the whole agreement. President Trump announces an immediate return to a policy of really intense economic pressure. So you can see the huge split this created, right? It's a massive asymmetry. You've got the rest of the world, we're talking Europe, Russia, China, all trying to keep the deal alive to salvage the framework. But the US, it was on a completely different path, already starting the process of slapping all those sanctions right back on. And let's be clear, the US withdrawal wasn't just, a simple policy reversal. It was the beginning of a whole new aggressive strategy. They called it maximum pressure. The idea was to use this intense economic and diplomatic force to basically corner Iran and get them back to the negotiating table, but this time on America's terms. So let's just walk through how fast things went south. I mean, look at 2019. It was nuts. In April, the US does something unprecedented. It labels a part of Iran's actual military, the IRGC, as a terrorist group. And it tries to choke off all of Iran's oil exports, down to zero. By June, we're seeing attacks on oil tankers, and Iran shoots down a US surveillance drone. And the year closes out with a US contractor killed in Iraq, which leads to US retaliatory strikes. It was a classic escalation ladder, Each side just kept climbing one rung higher. And that ladder, it led straight to this. January 2020. In a drone strike in Baghdad, the US kills one of Iran's most powerful and well-known military figures, Qasem Soleimani. The official line from the Pentagon was that this was a decisive defensive action, something done to protect US personnel and stop future attacks. But here's where you see the massive gulf in how this was viewed. Iran's perspective? The complete polar opposite. They called it a terrorist assassination and a great mistake. It's so clear. The two countries weren't just disagreeing on policy anymore. They were basically living in two totally different realities. 110. Iran's response was a barrage of ballistic missiles aimed at bases in Iraq where U.S. troops were stationed. Now, while no Americans were killed in the attack, that number, 110, that's how many U.S. service members were later diagnosed with traumatic brain injuries from the sheer force of the blasts. So yeah, the human cost was very, very real. Okay, so this is where we move into the period after 2021, and we get back to that projected timeline from our source. Because the cycle of tit for tat didn't stop in 2020. Not at all. It just set the stage for something even more direct and, frankly, a lot more dangerous.
So, according to this projected future, the conflict keeps simmering through proxies. In January 2024, an attack by an Iran-aligned group kills 3 U.S. soldiers, which triggers major U.S. retaliation. But then a huge line gets crossed. In June of 2025, the source describes the U.S. launching direct military strikes on Iranian soil, hitting key nuclear sites. And right after that, there's a huge diplomatic move. Somebody triggers the snapback mechanism.
So what exactly is this snapback? Well, it's a really interesting provision that was actually built into the original nuclear deal. What it does is it allows any of the original countries that signed the deal to unilaterally, all by themselves, force all of the old United Nations sanctions to just snap back into place. It's an incredibly powerful tool that can basically blow up the whole UN side of the agreement.
And that brings us right up to the present day in our source material. So picture this. After direct military strikes, after the UN part of the deal collapses, the cycle just keeps going. By February 2026, you've got indirect talks starting up again, even while the US is using new kinds of economic pressure. That pendulum, it just keeps on swinging. Which really leaves us with one last tough question to think about. When you look at this entire 70-year story, all the conflict, the pressure, the talks, it kind of seems like diplomacy doesn't happen because of trust, does it? It feels like it only comes back on the table after both sides have escalated things so much that the cost of more conflict is just too high. And talking becomes the only real option left. It's a pretty sobering thought about the real nature of this long, long war.